You're not who you say you are, Thomas McCready. The blind girl's whispered words cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk, stopping my heart mid-beat. Her clouded eyes stared past me towards something I couldn't see, but her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. How could she possibly know? I'd buried that name deeper than any grave in this godforsaken territory. Just 12 hours earlier, I'd been counting my last $2 in the dusty market square of Redemption Falls, watching the crowd gather around the auctioneer's platform with the detached interest of a man who had nothing left to lose. The merciless August sun beat down on wooden storefronts and dirt roads, creating shimmering heat waves that made the whole scene feel like a fever dream. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. That's when I saw her. She stood on the auction block in a faded blue dress that had once been fine, her auburn hair catching the golden light despite the grime and exhaustion etched into every line of her delicate face. But it was her eyes that stopped me cold, milky white with blindness, yet somehow seeing more than anyone else in that jeering crowd. "What am I bid for this fine specimen?" the auctioneer called out, his voice thick with whiskey and cruelty. "Young, healthy, and compliant, perfect for household work or other duties." The crowd's laughter made my stomach turn. I watched her chin lift with quiet defiance, even as her hands trembled at her sides. There was something about the way she held herself, like a queen facing execution with dignity intact. $2, I heard myself calling out, my voice cutting through the crowd's noise. It was every cent I had to my name. The auctioneer squinted at me, taking in my worn boots, patched jacket, and the 3-day stubble covering my jaw. $2 for Thomas McCready, he announced with a sneer. Anyone else? When no other bids came, I found myself walking toward that platform on unsteady legs, my silver coins burning in my palm. The girl turned her head toward the sound of my approaching footsteps, and for one impossible moment, I swore she looked directly into my soul. Now, as dawn breaks over the mountains and she speaks the name I haven't heard in 7 years, I realize that everything I thought I knew about yesterday's desperate transaction was wrong. The memory of her impossible words still echoes in my mind as I try to make sense of what just happened. Let me take you back to yesterday afternoon when everything changed. After paying those $2 and signing the papers with the name I'd been using for years, I'd expected to lead her to my small cabin like any other piece of property. But the moment we stepped off that platform, she surprised me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's dispersing chatter. "Not for buying me, for the kindness in your voice when you bid." I studied her profile as we walked through Redemption Falls Main Street. She moved with careful precision, one hand lightly touching my offered arm, while the other swept the air ahead of us with practiced efficiency. Her auburn hair, now that I could see it up close, held threads of gold that caught the late afternoon sun. "What's your name?" I asked, slowing my pace to match hers. "Clara Whitmore," she replied, then paused. "Though I suppose that doesn't matter now." "I belong to you." Something twisted in my chest at those words. "Nobody belongs to anybody, Miss Whitmore. We'll figure out a proper arrangement." She stopped walking so abruptly that a passing cowboy had to swerve around us. "You mean you're not going to—" Her voice trailed off, but the relief in her tone told me everything. "No, ma'am, I reckon you've been through enough without adding to your troubles." We walked the rest of the way to my cabin in comfortable silence, her hand still resting lightly on my arm. My place wasn't much, a one-room log structure I'd built myself, with a stone fireplace and a small window facing east toward the mountains. But it was clean and honest work had built it. "It smells like pine and coffee," she observed as we crossed the threshold. "And something else. Saddle leather?" "Good nose," I admitted, gesturing toward the corner where my saddle and gear hung on wooden pegs. "Coffee's always on. Pine comes from the logs still being green when I built this place." She turned in a slow circle, her hands outstretched to map the space. "You built this yourself." It wasn't a question. and something in her tone made me look at her more carefully. How'd you know that? The spacing between the logs is uneven, but deliberately so, like you were working around knots and natural curves instead of forcing straight lines. Store-bought lumber would be uniform. I stared at her, my coffee cup halfway to my lips. Most folks, even with perfect sight, wouldn't have noticed details like that. You're not what I expected, I said finally. What did you expect? Someone broken, someone who needed saving. She smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from her, and it transformed her entire face. Maybe I do need saving, Mr. McCready, just not in the way most people think. As evening settled over the mountains and I watched her move confidently around my small cabin, making herself useful despite her blindness, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stepped into something far more complicated than a simple act of charity. But how could I have known that before dawn, she'd shatter everything I thought I knew about myself? What happened next should have been my first warning that Clara Whitmore was no ordinary woman. After settling her in and sharing a simple supper of beans and hardtack, I'd offered her my bed and prepared to spend the night on the floor. But she'd insisted on taking the blanket by the fireplace, claiming she'd grown accustomed to harder sleeping arrangements. "Where did you come from before yesterday?" I asked as we sat by the dying fire, her hands stilled on the cup of coffee I'd given her. "Boston originally. My father was a professor of literature at Harvard University." That explained her refined speech, the way she held herself with unconscious dignity despite her circumstances. "What brought you all the way out here?" "A letter," she said bitterly, "from a man named Joseph Hartwell, claiming to be a rancher in need of an educated wife. He painted such a picture of prosperity and respectability that my late father's debts seemed manageable by comparison. But Hartwell wasn't what he claimed. Hartwell didn't exist." Her voice carried years of hurt and anger. "The man who met my train was Samuel Briggs, a saloon owner with debts of his own. He'd been buying up mail-order brides and selling them to pay off his gambling problems." I felt my hands curl into fists. "How long were you with him?" 3 months, long enough to learn that some people see blindness as weakness and weakness as opportunity. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw. This woman had survived hell and emerged with her spirit intact. "Well, you're safe now," I told her, meaning every word. She turned toward my voice, her clouded eyes reflecting the firelight. "Are you certain about that, Thomas? Men who pay for women at market squares usually have their own reasons." There was something in the way she said my name, a subtle emphasis that made the hair on my neck stand up. But before I could analyze it further, she was speaking again. "Tell me about yourself. What brought you to Redemption Falls?" "Work," I said simply. "Been drifting from town to town, taking whatever jobs I can find." "Running from something?" The question hit too close to home. "We've all got things we'd rather leave behind." She nodded as if that answer satisfied her, but I caught her head tilting slightly, the way someone might when listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. "The wind's picking up," she observed. "Storm coming." I looked toward the window, seeing nothing but clear stars. But within minutes, I could hear the first whistle of wind through the mountain passes. How had she known? "You've got quite an ear for weather. When you lose one sense, the others compensate," she said matter-of-factly. "Though sometimes I think I hear things that aren't quite natural." "What do you mean?" She was quiet for so long, I thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, "Sometimes I hear people's real names, even when they're using false ones. Voices carry truth, even when words don't." My blood went cold. "That's an unusual talent." "Unusual times call for unusual gifts," she replied softly. "Don't you think, Thomas?" Again that subtle emphasis, as if she were testing the weight of the name on her tongue. I made my excuses and settled down for the night, but sleep eluded me. Every time I started to drift off, I'd catch her shifting by the fire, and I'd swear I could feel those blind eyes watching me in the darkness. When I finally did sleep, my dreams were filled with memories of another name, another life, and the reasons I'd had to bury both 7 years ago. But I never imagined that by morning she'd speak that buried name aloud and force me to face the ghosts I'd been running from. Now you understand why her dawn revelation hit me like a physical blow. But let me tell you what happened in the hours between our fireside conversation and that world-shattering whisper. The storm Clara had predicted arrived with vengeance around midnight, battering my cabin with wind and rain that sounded like bullets against the logs. I'd been lying awake anyway, wrestling with the strange certainty that this blind woman could somehow see straight through the carefully constructed identity I'd built. Around 3 in the morning, I heard her moving, not the restless shifting of someone trying to sleep, but the purposeful movements of someone with a destination in mind. "Clara?" I called softly. "Shh." Her voice came from near the window. "Someone's coming." I sat up, instantly alert. Through the storm's noise, I could hear nothing except rain and wind, but I'd learned enough about Clara's unusual abilities to trust her instincts. Moving silently, I retrieved my Colt from its place by my bedroll and joined her at the window. The glass was too rain-streaked to see anything clearly, but as lightning flickered across the sky, I caught a glimpse of 3 riders approaching through the storm. "Who would be traveling in this weather?" Clara whispered. "Nobody with honest intentions," I replied, checking the cylinder of my gun. The riders stopped just outside the circle of light from my window. One of them, a tall man in a dark coat, dismounted and approached the door. "McCready," he called out, his voice cutting through the storm. "Thomas McCready, we know you're in there." My blood turned to ice. Nobody in Redemption Falls should have reason to know my business, and certainly not enough to track me through a storm. Clara's hand found my arm. "They're not here for Thomas McCready," she whispered, her voice so low I had to lean close to hear. "They're here for the man you used to be." Before I could ask what she meant, the stranger called out again, "We've got business with you, William Carson." The name hit me like a physical blow. William Carson had been dead and buried for 7 years. Or so I'd thought. "How?" I breathed. Clara turned her blind eyes toward me, and in the lightning's flicker, I swear they seemed to see everything. "The past has a way of finding us, doesn't it, William?" The sound of my real name from her lips was almost as shocking as hearing it from the stranger outside. But there was no time to process the impossibility of it because the man at my door was speaking again. "We know about the gold, Carson, the Confederate gold you and your brother stole from that Army payroll train in '68. Time to pay what you owe." My mind raced. The Jameson brothers, the ones who'd hired us for that job, had sworn they'd never talk if we were caught. But 7 years was a long time, and gold made men do desperate things. "There's a back window," I whispered to Clara. "I'm going to get you out of here." "No." Her grip on my arm tightened. "If you run now, they'll never stop hunting, and next time they might hurt innocent people to get to you." "I won't let them hurt you." "Then trust me," she said, her voice carrying that strange certainty again and again, "and trust that some debts can only be paid by facing them head on." Lightning crashed again, illuminating her face with its stark white light, and in that moment I realized that somehow, impossibly, this blind woman who'd known my real name from the beginning might be the key to finally ending the 7-year nightmare I'd been running from. What Clara did next changed everything I thought I knew about courage, trust, and the woman I'd bought for $2 silver. "William Carson," the voice outside called again, more insistent now. "You've got 1 minute to come out or we start shooting." I could hear the other 2 riders moving around my cabin, positioning themselves to cut off any escape routes. These weren't random bounty hunters. They knew exactly what they were doing. "They'll burn us out if we wait," I whispered to Clara. "No, they won't," she replied with unsettling certainty. "They need you alive. Dead men can't tell them where the gold is hidden." She was right, of course, but that didn't mean they wouldn't hurt her to get to me. "Listen to me," I said urgently. "There's something I need to tell you about that gold they mentioned. You and your brothers robbed a Confederate payroll train carrying Union gold that had been captured earlier." She interrupted quietly. $50,000 in gold bars. You split it 3 ways, but before you could spend it, federal marshals tracked down your brothers. They died in the shootout, and you disappeared." I stared at her in the darkness, my mouth dry as desert sand. "How could you possibly know all that?" "The same way I knew your real name," she said simply. "Some voices carry their secrets, whether they mean to or not." 30 seconds, Carson." Clara stood up with sudden resolve. "I'm going out there." "Like hell you are. I grabbed her wrist, but she pulled free with surprising strength. They don't know about me, she said. To them, I'm just Thomas McCready's purchased property. Let me talk to them. Clara, no. But she was already moving toward the door with that careful, purposeful grace I'd come to recognize. Before I could stop her, she'd lifted the wooden bar and stepped out into the storm. Please don't shoot, she called out, her voice taking on the trembling quality of a frightened woman. I'm just a blind girl. Mr. McCready isn't here. Through the window, I watched the lead rider approach her. Even in the storm's darkness, I could see he was a large man with the kind of face that had seen too much violence. Where is he? The man demanded. He rode out yesterday evening, Clara replied, her whole body shaking now. Whether from cold or fear, I couldn't tell. Said something about checking his traps in the high country. Won't be back for days. You're lying. Please, sir. I'm just a blind girl. I can't even see you to lie to you properly. Her voice broke on the last word, and I had to admire her acting ability. The man studied her for a long moment, then turned to confer with his companions. I used their distraction to slip out the back window Clara had mentioned, circling around behind them with my Colt ready. Search the cabin, I heard the leader say. If she's lying, we'll know soon enough. That's when I stepped out of the shadows with my gun aimed at his back. Looking for me? I called out. All three men spun toward my voice, but I already had the advantage. Easy now, just want to talk. The leader smiled, showing teeth like old tombstones. Well, William Carson, alive and mostly well. You've led us quite a chase, brother. I don't know you. Name's Jeremiah Black. I worked with the Jameson brothers before they hired you for that train job. They told me all about the helpful Carson boys and their little gold problem before federal bullets shut them up permanent-like. My heart sank. If Black knew the Jamesons, he'd know details that only someone connected to the job could know. What do you want? My cut, Black said simply. The Jamesons owed me money, and now that they're dead, their debts fall to their business partners, namely, you. I don't have any gold. Black's eyes shifted to Clara, who stood perfectly still in the rain, her blind eyes fixed on something beyond all of us. Maybe not here, but you'll get it, won't you? For the sake of your little blind bird? The threat in his voice made my blood boil, but before I could respond, Clara spoke. He can't get what doesn't exist anymore. Clara's words hung in the storm-charged air like a challenge, and I realized she was about to reveal something that could either save us or get us both killed. Black's attention snapped to her with predatory interest. What did you say, girlie? The gold, Clara repeated, her voice steady despite the rain soaking through her thin dress. It doesn't exist anymore. Not the way you think it does. Clara, don't, I started, but she held up a hand to silence me. You're looking for 50,000 in gold bars, aren't you, Mr. Black? She continued. But you're 7 years too late. Black took a step toward her, his hand moving to the gun at his hip. You better start making sense, blind girl. The Carson brothers never got to spend their shares because you killed them first, Clara said with chilling matter-of-fact delivery. But William here, he had 3 years before he went into hiding. 3 years to turn stolen gold into something else entirely. I stared at her, wondering how she could possibly know what I'd done with my share. I'd never told a living soul. What kind of something else? Black demanded. Clara tilted her head toward me, her clouded eyes somehow finding mine across the darkness. Tell him, William, tell him about the school. My knees nearly gave out. The school? How could she know about the school? What school? Black's voice was getting dangerous. The Whitmore School for the Blind, Clara said quietly, in Denver. Built with anonymous donations starting in 1870. Fully funded, with an endowment that supports 24 students and 6 teachers. Black's face went white. You gave away $50,000 to build a damn school? Not all of it, I found myself saying, my voice hollow with shock. I kept enough to live on, but most of it, yes, I gave it away. You lying son of a... He's not lying. Clara's voice cut through Black's rising fury. And I should know. My father was one of the first teachers hired by that anonymous donor. Before he died, he received 7 years' worth of correspondence from a William Carson in care of various frontier towns, always with instructions to continue the good work and never reveal the source of the funding. The truth hit me like a lightning bolt. Your father, Professor Whitmore, James Whitmore, formerly of Harvard, later head of literature instruction at a school for the blind, Clara confirmed. A school that saved my life when Boston society decided a blind professor's daughter was more burden than blessing. Black was looking between us with growing rage and confusion. This is all very touching, but it doesn't solve my problem. I'm owed money. By dead men, I pointed out. The Jamesons are beyond paying debts. But you're not. Black's gun was in his hand now, though he kept it lowered. And I figure a man who'd give away stolen gold to help blind children might be motivated to find replacement funds to protect one blind woman. The threat was crystal clear. He'd hold Clara hostage until I somehow came up with the money he felt he was owed. There's just one problem with your plan, Mr. Black, Clara said, her voice taking on that strange knowing quality again. What's that? You're assuming I need William's protection. Her chin lifted with quiet dignity. But you've made a miscalculation about who's really in danger here. Black laughed, a sound like grinding stone. You threatening me, blind girl? Huh? I got news for you. I don't make war on helpless women. Helpless? Clara smiled, and it was nothing like the gentle expression I'd seen from her before. Mr. Black, how do you think I knew about the school, about the gold, about William's real name? Lucky guesses. Or maybe, Clara said, taking a step toward him, despite his drawn gun, I'm not quite who you think I am either. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Clara was moving with perfect confidence through the storm-dark night, stepping around puddles and obstacles as if she could see them clearly. And suddenly I realized that the woman I'd bought for $2 might have secrets that ran even deeper than my own. The revelation that Clara could navigate the darkness with impossible precision should have been my first clue. But what happened next revealed the true scope of her deception. You boys might want to think real careful about your next move, Clara said, her voice carrying a new authority that made even Black hesitate. See, you've been operating under some dangerous assumptions. Such as? Black kept his gun ready, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his posture. Such as assuming William Carson was just a common outlaw who got lucky with one big score. Clara moved closer to me, and I caught the faintest scent of something that hadn't been there before. Gunpowder. But William Carson was a Union spy during the war, wasn't he, William? My world tilted sideways. How do you... The train you robbed wasn't carrying Confederate payroll, she continued, her blind eyes somehow fixed on Black's face. It was carrying Union gold that had been stolen by Confederate raiders. Your job was to retrieve it and return it to federal custody. Black's face went pale. That's impossible. Is it? Check your facts, Mr. Black. The Jameson brothers thought they were hiring outlaws for a robbery, but William and his brothers were following federal orders. The gold was supposed to be returned to the Union Army, but somewhere along the way, the brothers got greedy. I felt sick as the truth she was speaking sank in. The school, that's why I gave it away. I was trying to make amends, Clara finished, for keeping gold that belonged to the government you'd sworn to serve. Black's gun was wavering now. Even if that's true, it doesn't change anything. The Jamesons still owed me money. Actually, it changes everything. A new voice cut through the storm, and I spun to see 3 men emerging from the darkness behind Black's riders, all wearing federal marshal's badges. Marshal Crawford, Clara called out as if she'd been expecting them. Perfect timing. The lead marshal, a weathered man with steel gray hair, approached with his weapon drawn but not aimed at me. Miss Whitmore, is this our man? Both of them, Clara replied. William Carson, also known as Thomas McCready, federal agent gone rogue, and Jeremiah Black, wanted for the murder of federal witnesses James and Robert Jameson. Black spun his gun toward Clara, but I was already moving. My Colt barked once in the storm, and Black crumpled to the muddy ground, clutching his shoulder. Federal agent? I stared at Clara as the marshals moved to secure Black's companions. Miss Whitmore, I think you owe me some explanations. She turned toward me, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked directly into my eyes, really looked, as if she could see every detail of my face. "My name isn't Clara Whitmore," she said quietly. "It's Agent Caroline Winters, Department of the Treasury. I've been tracking both you and Black for the past 6 months." "But you're blind." "No, William, I'm not." She reached up and carefully removed what I now realize were clouded glass discs from her eyes, revealing perfectly clear hazel irises underneath. Though I did attend the Whitmore School, as an investigator looking into the source of those anonymous donations, I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The auction, Briggs selling you, all part of the operation. We knew Black was closing in on you, and we needed someone on the inside. She looked down at her hands. Though I'll admit, the plan didn't account for finding an outlaw who'd spent 7 years trying to make amends for his crimes. Marshal Crawford approached us, holstering his weapon. "Agent Winters, the Treasury Department has reviewed Carson's case. Given the circumstances of the original theft and his subsequent restitution efforts, there's been a decision made." "What kind of decision?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Caroline, looked up at me with eyes that now held no pretense, only something that looked suspiciously like regret. "The kind that means you're not going to prison, William Carson, but you're also never going to be Thomas McCready again." Standing in my doorway as dawn broke over the mountains, watching federal marshals load Jeremiah Black into their wagon, I felt like my entire life had been revealed as an elaborate lie. But Caroline's next words would prove that some deceptions run deeper than others. "There's more," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "About the school, about your father." Marshal Crawford had finished his business and was preparing to leave, but he paused at Caroline's words. "Agent Winters, that information is classified." "He deserves to know," she interrupted. "He's paid for his mistakes 10 times over." I looked between them, feeling like a man about to receive a terminal diagnosis. "What about my father?" Caroline took a deep breath. "Professor James Whitmore wasn't just a teacher at the school you funded, William. He was also a federal intelligence analyst, tasked with tracking the disposition of stolen Confederate assets after the war." "I don't understand." "Your father never abandoned you and your brothers," she continued, her voice gentle but implacable. "He was working undercover, trying to recover stolen government funds. The train job you pulled? He'd been tracking that gold for 2 years. The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. My father was trying to recover the same gold we stole? More than that, he knew about the plan. He'd been feeding information to federal authorities, trying to set up a clean recovery operation." Caroline's false blindness had been replaced by something far more devastating: pity. "The Jameson brothers found out about his involvement. They killed him 3 days before your train job." I sat down heavily on my cabin's front step, my legs no longer able to support me. "He's dead?" "Murdered by the same men who hired you, which means every dollar you gave to that school, every year you spent trying to make amends. You were honoring a man who died trying to do the right thing." Marshal Crawford cleared his throat. "There's a grave in Denver, Carson, marked James Whitmore, beloved father and patriot. Your donations paid for the headstone without knowing it. 7 years of guilt, 7 years of running, 7 years of thinking I dishonored my family's name, all based on a lie told by men who'd murdered the father I thought had abandoned us. Why didn't anyone tell me?" My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Because you disappeared," Carolyn said. "Federal authorities spent 3 years looking for William Carson to give him the truth about his father's death and offer him immunity for his cooperation. But Thomas McCready was too good at staying hidden." I looked up at her, seeing her clearly for the first time. "And you? How much of what you told me was true?" "Almost none of it." She sat down beside me on the step, her shoulder barely touching mine. "I was never blind, never sold at auction, never desperate or alone." She paused. "But the way you treated someone you believed was helpless and vulnerable, that was all real. And it told me everything I needed to know about who William Carson really is." "Which is what, exactly?" "A good man who made bad choices for understandable reasons. then spent 7 years trying to make them right. Marshall Crawford approached us one final time. Carson, the Treasury Department has an offer. Your knowledge of outlaw networks, combined with your unique experience, could be valuable. We're prepared to offer you a clean identity and a fresh start in exchange for occasional consulting work. I looked at the badge in his outstretched hand, then at Caroline's face. And if I say no, then you're free to go. Thomas McCready has no outstanding warrants, and William Carson's crimes have been overlooked, given the circumstances. What about her? I nodded toward Carolyn. Agent Winters has a new assignment waiting in San Francisco, Crawford replied. Unless, of course, she requests a transfer. Caroline's cheeks flushed pink. William, I know I deceived you about everything, but you also saw me do the right thing when you needed help, even though you didn't really need it. I stood up, decision crystallizing in my mind. Marshall Crawford, I'll take your offer, on one condition. What's that? I looked at Carolyn, hoping I was reading the expression in her eyes correctly. I want Agent Winters as my partner. Caroline's answer to my partnership proposal would determine whether the deceptions between us had built something real or merely revealed how thoroughly we'd fooled each other. You want me as your partner? She asked, her professional composure cracking for the first time since she'd revealed her true identity. After everything I lied about? You lied about being blind, being helpless, and being bought at auction, I said, standing up and extending my hand to help her to her feet. But when you thought I was just Thomas McCready, a broke cowboy who'd spent his last $2 on you, you still treated me with respect and kindness. That wasn't acting. She took my hand but didn't immediately stand. How can you be sure? Because I've spent 7 years learning to read people's real intentions beneath their necessary lies. And because I paused, realizing I was about to admit something I'd barely acknowledged to myself. Because in one day with you, I felt more like the man I used to be than I have in 7 years of running from him. Marshall Crawford was watching this exchange with the patient expression of a man who'd seen plenty of complicated situations resolve themselves. Agent Winters, the San Francisco assignment can wait. The Treasury Department values effective partnerships. Carolyn stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. There's still a lot you don't know about me, William. A lot I can't tell you, even now. Same here, I replied. But maybe that's not the worst foundation for a partnership. We've both proven we can work together when it matters. Even though I bought you under false pretenses? You didn't buy me, I corrected. I bought you, remember? $2 silver that turned out to be the best investment I ever made. She smiled at that, the first genuinely unguarded expression I'd seen from her. The Treasury Department doesn't usually approve of agents getting personally involved with their partners. Good thing we're not personally involved, I said, then added with a grin, yet. Her laugh was like water over stones, natural and musical. Agent Carson has a point, Marshall. Professional partnerships require trust, and we've certainly tested that under fire. Crawford nodded approvingly. Then it's settled. Agent Carson, Agent Winters, your first assignment is to help us roll up the remainder of Black's network. Seems he's been running a sophisticated operation, using fake mail-order bride schemes to traffic women while fencing stolen goods through frontier markets. The mention of trafficked women made my blood run cold. How many women like you thought you were? Too many, Carolyn replied grimly, and most of them don't have federal backup when things go wrong. Then we better get to work, I said, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since before the war. As Marshall Crawford and his men rode away with their prisoners, Caroline and I stood together outside my cabin, the cabin that now felt like the end of one life and the beginning of another. So what happens now, she asked. Now we go inside. You tell me your real story over real coffee, and I tell you mine, I said. Then we figure out how two people who've been living lies for so long start building something honest together. Professional partnership honest, or I looked at her, really looked at her, seeing past the deception to the courage underneath, the intelligence, the strength that had allowed her to walk into danger to protect both of us. Let's start with professionals and see where it takes us. That's probably wise, she agreed, but she was smiling as she said it. As we walked back toward the cabin, she added, though there is one thing I should mention about our partnership. What's that? The Treasury Department is going to want to relocate us. This cabin, this identity, Thomas McCready's life ends today. I paused at the doorway, looking back at the small space I'd called home for 2 years. It had been a good hiding place, but Caroline was right. It was time to stop hiding. Any idea where they'll send us? Could be anywhere, Denver, San Francisco, maybe even back east. I held the door open for her, and as she passed me, I caught that faint scent of gunpowder again, and realized it wasn't from her hidden weapons, but from the dangerous work that lay ahead of us. Well then, Agent Winters, looks like our real adventure is just beginning. What happened over the next several hours in my small cabin would reshape everything I thought I knew about trust, partnership, and the possibility of love born from the most unlikely circumstances. Caroline, I was still adjusting to her real name, moved through my space with the same purposeful grace she'd shown as a blind woman. But now I could see the trained precision behind every gesture. She examined my belongings with professional interest, noting details I hadn't even realized were revealing. "You kept them," she said, pausing at my small wooden chest. "Kept what?" She lifted out a bundle of letters yellowed with age and tied with string. Letters from the Whitmore School, 7 years' worth of progress reports and thank you notes. I'd forgotten about those letters, hidden away like evidence of a crime I couldn't bring myself to destroy. I needed to know the money was being used properly. "Listen to this," she said, unfolding one at random. "Dear anonymous benefactor, this month we welcomed 3 new students whose families could not otherwise afford their education. Young Sarah Murphy, blinded in a mill accident, is already showing remarkable progress in mathematics. Your generosity has given these children hope for futures they never dreamed possible." She looked up at me with eyes that held no pretense now, only something that looked like wonder. "William, do you realize what you accomplished? Not just with the money, but with the way you monitored its use? Most donors give once and forget. You spent 7 years making sure every dollar served its purpose." "It was stolen money," I said. "I had to make sure." "You had to make sure it did more good than harm," she finished. "That's not the thinking of a criminal. That's the thinking of a man trying to heal the world." She set the letters aside and pulled out something else from my chest. A daguerreotype of 3 young men in Union Army uniforms. "Your brothers?" "Jacob and Samuel," I confirmed, looking at faces I'd tried hard to forget. "They were good men, better than me in some ways. They followed you into that train job." "They trusted me," I corrected, "and I led them to their deaths because I was too proud to admit I was in over my head with the Jameson brothers." Caroline studied the photograph for a long moment. "You know what I see when I look at this picture? 3 boys who enlisted to serve their country, 3 brothers who stuck together through hell, and 1 man who spent 7 years punishing himself for surviving when they didn't." "Caroline, Agent Winters conducted an investigation," she interrupted gently. "But Caroline thinks Agent Carson has been carrying guilt that belongs to other people." She set the daguerreotype on my table and turned to face me fully. "The morning we met at that auction, what made you bid on me?" "I told you, the way you held yourself, your dignity." "But why did that matter to you? You didn't know me. You could barely afford to feed yourself, much less take on responsibility for another person." I thought about it, trying to articulate something I'd felt but never examined. Because someone needed help, and I was in a position to provide it, even if it was all I had. "Exactly," she took a step closer. "That's who you are, William. Not the man who's made mistakes during a war, but the man who spent his last $2 to help a stranger. Even though the stranger turned out to be a federal agent who didn't need help, especially because of that." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Do you know how rare it is to find someone who does the right thing when they think no one is watching? When there's no reward, no recognition, no benefit to themselves?" I stared at her, seeing something in her expression that made my chest tight. "Caroline, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Agent Winters was assigned to investigate William Carson and determine whether he was a criminal or a patriot." She was close enough now that I could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. "But Caroline fell in love with Thomas McCready." The words hit me like a physical force, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "That's impossible," I managed. Thomas McCready doesn't exist. He's just a name I made up. Is he? She reached up and touched my cheek with fingers that were surprisingly gentle. Because the man who bought a blind girl at auction, who offered her his bed while he slept on the floor, who was willing to face armed outlaws to protect her, that man exists. I've seen him. Before I could respond, she stood on her tiptoes and kissed me, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty as I wrapped my arms around her. When we finally broke apart, I rested my forehead against hers. So what happens to us now, Agent Winters? Now we find out if two people who met under false pretenses can build something real together, she whispered. Outside, storm clouds were breaking apart, and the first rays of true sunlight were streaming through my window, illuminating the beginning of whatever came next. The sunlight streaming through my cabin window should have felt like a new beginning, but Caroline's next words reminded me that some endings require more than dawn to complete. There's still one more thing, William, she said, stepping back from our embrace, but keeping her hands on my shoulders. About the assignment in San Francisco. What about it? It's not just any assignment. We'll be going undercover as a married couple. I felt my eyebrows rise. Married couple? The Treasury Department has identified a smuggling operation that's been using newlywed settlers as unwitting couriers. Couples moving west with wedding gifts that contain hidden compartments, household goods with false bottoms. It's brilliant, actually. Who questions a young couple starting their new life together? And they want us to pose as newlyweds, complete with fabricated courtship history, marriage certificate, and all the documentation needed to establish ourselves as Daniel and Catherine Morrison, recently wed and seeking their fortune in California. I walked to my window, looking out at the mountains that had sheltered Thomas McCready for 2 years. How long would this assignment last? 6 months, possibly longer. Long enough to infiltrate the network and gather evidence for prosecutions. 6 months of pretending to be married to you, I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. Would that be difficult for you? I turned back to her, seeing uncertainty in her expression for the first time since she'd revealed her true identity. Difficult? Caroline, 5 minutes ago you kissed me and told me you'd fallen in love with a man who doesn't officially exist. Now you're asking if I'd find it difficult to pretend to be married to you. When you put it that way, it does sound rather complicated. Complicated doesn't begin to cover it. I crossed the room to her, close enough to see the rapid pulse at the base of her throat. But not for the reasons you think. What reasons, then? Because I'm afraid that 6 months of pretending to be your husband might not be enough. Her breath caught. William, you said Caroline fell in love with Thomas McCready. Well, William Carson is falling in love with Agent Winters, and Daniel Morrison is going to fall in love with Catherine Morrison. Where does that leave us when the assignment ends? I don't know, she admitted. I've never been in this situation before. Neither have I, but I know one thing. If we're going to do this, we do it honestly. No more deceptions between us, even if we have to lie to everyone else. Agreed. She extended her hand for a formal shake. Partners? I took her hand but didn't shake it. Instead, I brought it to my lips and kissed her knuckles gently. Partners, in everything. The gesture made her smile, and I realized I wanted to spend considerable time learning all the different ways Caroline Winters could smile. So what's our first step? I asked. We travel to Denver, where the Treasury Department will provide us with our new identities and brief us on the operation. Then we take the train to San Francisco as Daniel and Catherine Morrison, newlyweds seeking adventure in the growing city. And between now and then, we practice being a couple, so in love that no one questions our story. I grinned at her. I think I can manage that. Can you? Because it means holding my hand in public, calling me darling, acting like a man who can barely keep his hands off his new bride. Caroline, I said, stepping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to look at me, I bought you for $2 at a frontier market, and within 24 hours, you turned my entire world upside down. Acting like a man who can't keep his hands off you isn't going to require much acting. Her cheeks flushed pink. We should probably pack. The Denver train leaves this afternoon. Probably, I agreed, but neither of us moved. William? Yes? When this assignment is over, when we're not Daniel and Catherine Morrison anymore, what happens to us then? I cupped her face in my hands, marveling at the fact that I could see her eyes clearly now, could read every emotion flickering across her features. Then we'll find out if William Carson and Caroline Winters can be as happy together as their aliases. She leaned into my touch. I'd like that. So would I. As we finally began gathering our few possessions for the journey ahead, I couldn't help but think that sometimes the best partnerships are born from the most unlikely circumstances. And sometimes love finds you exactly when you're not looking for it, in the form of a woman who costs $2 silver and changes everything. 6 months later, I stood on the dock in San Francisco Bay, watching the sun set over water that sparkled like scattered gold coins, thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought me to this moment. The smuggling operation had been even more extensive than the Treasury Department had suspected. Daniel and Catherine Morrison had played their parts perfectly, infiltrating a network that stretched from California to New York, using newlywed couples to transport everything from stolen bonds to counterfeit currency. We'd gathered enough evidence to prosecute 43 individuals, and more importantly, we'd rescued dozens of women who'd been coerced into the scheme through fake marriage arrangements. But as successful as the assignment had been professionally, it was the personal revelations that truly mattered. "You're thinking too hard again," Carolyn said, slipping her arm through mine as she joined me at the dock's railing. "I can practically hear the gears turning. Just reflecting on how much has changed since that morning in Redemption Falls. Do you miss it? The simple life of Thomas McCready?" I considered the question seriously. I miss the peace of it sometimes. But Thomas McCready was hiding from life. William Carson is finally living it. She smiled, the expression I'd come to love more than any sight in the world. "And what about Daniel Morrison? Do you miss him?" "Daniel Morrison was easy to love," I said, turning to face her fully. "He got to wake up every morning next to the most incredible woman he'd ever met. He got to hold her hand in public, kiss her whenever he wanted, and tell everyone who'd listen how lucky he was. But Daniel Morrison was living a lie, and William Carson wants something real." Carolyn's eyes reflected the golden sunset as she looked up at me. "What kind of real?" Instead of answering with words, I dropped to one knee right there on the dock, pulling out a simple gold band I'd bought with my first legitimate Treasury Department paycheck. "Caroline Winters," I said, my voice carrying over the sound of waves lapping against the pier, "I'm done pretending. I don't want to be your partner just for assignments. I don't want to love you just when we're undercover. I want to love you as William Carson loves Caroline Winters, honestly and openly and forever." Her hand flew to her mouth, eyes wide with surprise. "William, I know we've built our relationship on a foundation of necessary deceptions, and I know we both have dangerous work ahead of us. But I also know that every time I thought I was pretending to love you, I was actually just loving you without pretense." A crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the romantic spectacle, but I only had eyes for her. "Carolyn, will you marry me? Not as cover identities, not for an assignment, but as yourself, choosing to build a real life with me?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, yes, William Carson, I'll marry you." I slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to kiss her, and the small crowd that had gathered burst into spontaneous applause. As I held her close, I marveled at how a woman who'd cost me $2 silver had enriched my life beyond measure. "So what happens now?" she whispered against my lips. "Now we go home." "Where's home?" "Wherever we are together." 3 months later, we were married in a small ceremony in Denver, witnessed by Marshall Crawford and the staff of the Whitmore School for the Blind, the place where our story had truly begun, even before we met. I wore my father's watch, finally reclaimed from the federal evidence room, and Caroline carried a bouquet of wildflowers from the mountains where Thomas McCready had found his redemption. Our first assignment as a married couple took us to Montana, where we spent a year dismantling a cattle rustling operation. Our second sent us to New Mexico, tracking counterfeiters. Each mission brought new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to prove that a partnership born from deception could become something stronger than either of us had ever imagined. But it's the quiet moments I treasure most. Early mornings when Caroline makes coffee in whatever temporary home we're occupying. Evenings when we sit together planning our next case. Nights when she falls asleep in my arms, and I'm reminded that some of life's greatest treasures come disguised as $2 transactions at frontier markets. I learned that love isn't about perfect honesty from the beginning. It's about choosing truth once you've found someone worth being honest with. And sometimes the best partnerships are forged not in ideal circumstances, but in the fire of shared danger and mutual trust. Carolyn taught me that redemption isn't about erasing the past, but about using it to build a better future. The gold I'd given away had created something beautiful, a school that continued to help blind children long after I disappeared into Thomas McCready's false identity. But the love I'd found with Caroline created something even more precious, a future where William Carson could finally stop running from his past and start building toward tomorrow. If you've enjoyed this tale of love found in unlikely places and redemption discovered through partnership, I'd be honored if you'd share it with others who believe in second chances. Sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the simplest transactions, and sometimes $2 silver can buy you everything that matters. Thank you for joining William and Caroline on their journey from deception to truth, from loneliness to love, and from running away to running towards something better together.